Okay, so let's follow up on the last video clip where we looked at the idea of tiling a texture and then how there may be issues with seams and so on in those tiles. Now I've provided you with all the textures I'm going to talk through here so you can look in more detail as you go along. I've even named them to help you to understand what each one involves talking about, or the discussion points around that. Now we've seen the silhouette one, which was that one. We're kind of okay with that, but I want to move on to the next one, which is 01 hardwood 1K. Okay, now the reason it's called 1K is because it's what we call a 1K texture map. Now I developed these myself, or rather I sourced these myself. I didn't make them myself, I sourced them myself, and I looked specifically for texture maps or images which would work as texture maps or indeed not work, so I could prove the point that they wouldn't work. But I looked for ones of a specific type and size. Now if you're not sure about what the size is on some of these, if you right click, I'm working on a Mac, you're probably working on a PC, but if you right click you can usually get properties or information. So for me it'd be get info, and if we look on here you can see dimensions 1000 by 1000, and that's pixels. Okay, there's other stuff like it's RGB, there's no alpha channel and so on, but 1000 by 1000, so that's 1K. It's a 1K texture, which is pretty decent. So let's have a look at that texture map. So we've got this kind of thing here. So it's kind of let's say a fairly fancy wooden floor setup. Now the reason I want to show you this is because I want to discuss this idea of how well this would tile. Well, the first thing we'll be looking at to judge this is, first of all, how square are these elements? Because if you've got any skew in, like let's say that this one's slightly taller than the one at the other end, then that's not going to tile too well. So that's going to be an issue straight away. Now, if you're not sure and you just source an image or you just photograph an image, the best thing to do is to drop it into your Maya scene, try tiling it and see what you get. So we'll do just that. Okay, so we'll close that one down. We'll come back to the rest of them as we go along. We'll do this for each one. We'll see what it actually looks like as we go along. So we've still got our little background there. I'll use this same surface, although it's a floor. It doesn't really matter that it's vertical rather than horizontal. But we'll go with that. Okay, so we'll go in to our file here, and we'll just change the file that we're dealing with. Bear with me 1 second. I think I'll have to actually go back this way. Why is it not letting me go back that way to the file? Anyway, never mind. We'll go back into the attribute editor and I'll find it directly. Okay, so color in there. Where's my file? There it is. I think I just scrolled down, that's why I couldn't find it. So we'll go into there, we'll load up our hardwood 1K texture, we'll open that one up, and there we have it. So we can see this here, and this is currently, if we remember, it's currently tiled. So I'm just going to untile it, let's say, and this is the kind of texture that we end up with, which is actually pretty neat. It's a 1K texture, so it'll hold up pretty well to some scrutiny. It's not too bad. But the thing, of course, we want to check with this is whether or not this will tile effectively. So I'm going to repeat it twice and twice, something like that. And let's have a look. How well does it tile? Let's zoom in. Now we know that this was 4 by 4. And what we're looking at is whether this element matches up. It matches pretty well. It may be a pixel or two out. That's fine. When you're laying down a wooden floor, believe me, and I've had a go, it's difficult to get things to match up perfectly. If this was way out, like this joined up here to a point which was down here, that's when you're going to have issues. So that tiles pretty well. It's not too bad. And certainly, if you, let's just flip this on its end as if it was a floor or something. We'll do it that kind of way. In fact, tell you what we'll do, just as a reminder for what we're doing and how this works, we'll go in and we'll apply it to a different face. So we'll go into our UV toolkit, we'll go to best plane, that plane there, press enter, and we put it onto the top plane instead. That's better. It's a bit easier to work with in this setup here. So if we add something like this, and we add multiple versions of this, it's probably going to be less likely we'd notice any errors in alignment, if they're subtle errors. If it's way out, way out, then you'll notice issues with that. So I'll go back into attribute editor. I'm going to go back into that set there, and I'm going to do just a few more tiles. Remember, we'll go 4 by 4, something like that. If you did have a floor, like this, and you're fairly close down to it or something, you're not going to notice any tile errors there. Okay, it's pretty good. Now, there is something you would start to notice when you've got repetition like this, particularly if you've got a lot of repetition, and that would be, though not seams, you'll notice repetition in pattern. So I can see there's a very definite kind of stripe almost of colour that runs up here and repeats itself here, and in fact here as well. So the repetition in pattern could become an issue. If you've only got let's say a couple of repeats of this, you're less likely to see it. But repetition in pattern can also be an issue. Okay, so if you've got standout blemishes, standout kind of marks, something like that, I don't know, a paint splodge, a spill on the wood. If you're working with woodwork and there's a splash of paint on one, not woodwork, but stone or something like that, there's a splash of paint on one of the stones or something, that repetition in that splash will probably need to be removed before you create a tileable texture. Anyway, so that's the first one looked at. Let's move on to our next one. Okay, so we've got something like this. Now, what's wrong with that as a texture map? Well, a lot. Quite a lot actually. So clearly that's not going to work as a texture map because that is very much a perspective 3/4 view of an environment. Now, in order to use it as a texture map, it would need quite a bit of post-production. We'd have to flatten out this area, so we'd have to, if you like, unskew it or deskew it. I'm not sure what the right term is there, but we'll go for deskew. We'd also have an issue with the fact that there's a lot of reflection in here, which would also come through in the texture map, because one of the key things you need to remember when you're working with texture mapping is that essentially you would like to put the reflection in afterwards. You would like to put the highlight in and the shade in, any specularity, any reflection after the event, because you're going to do that in your scene. You want it to be reflecting the elements in your scene, not reflecting the elements that were in the environment when you took the photograph. Okay, so that also would be an issue. Now, I don't even know that I even need to apply that to our object here to prove the point, but I will anyway. Let's do it anyway. So let's go in here. Poor angle, we'll call that, because it is. And if we add that one in there, we don't. Well, I'll remove the tile purely just so we can see it as a basic image. So we'll go 1 and 1, and we end up with this kind of thing. I'll just spin around. So yep, it's a great background image, but that's not going to work as a floor texture. Of course, it's not. Okay, so again, think carefully about the angle that you take your photographs at, and you should be aiming to take your own images when you're working with this. Okay, taking someone else's is okay to a point. You're certainly not going to want to be taking somebody else's image and claim it as your own, because that's plagiarism. It's theft of an image. It's theft of someone else's artwork or photograph. So you're not sure. You shouldn't be doing that anyway. It's always going to be better to come up with your own catalogue of image sources that you can work with. Texture maps, for example, that's always going to be a good thing. That's not going to work well for obvious reasons, so we'll skip that one. We'll move beyond that one. Okay, so the next one here, I've got a wooden floor, which is a seamless texture, or so it claims. So we'll add it on. However, this one is only 0.5K. So again, if we just go in here and get info, you'll see it's 500 by 500. So again, this is lower resolution than the hard one would 1K one, but let's see if that actually makes a difference. So we'll go into our file, go in here, load up our 0.5K texture map, and we'll have a look. So it looks pretty good. It looks pretty good in our view. Okay, it's not too bad. Now, the issue will come when or if you get very close to your object, as that's when you'll see the breakdown in the quality of the texture map. If you've got something like this, which is going to be repeated, so we'll do our old trick of repeating this a number of times, so maybe we'll go 5 by 5 or something like that. If you did something like that, the chances are the resolution of it's not going to be an issue. It's not going to be too problematic. But there are other issues, of course, with this. Because we've shrunk it down, i.e. UV mapped it, repeated the UV, tiled it, if you will, of course, the scale of this, the resolution of it, is slightly less important because there's more of them to kind of fill in the space. But very, very clearly, there are issues with this in terms of tiling. I mean, this I did download, and it claims to be a tileable texture map, or seamless texture map. I would argue that it is almost certainly not. tileable. In fact, let's go in and we'll make this two UVs by 2, so we've got a very obvious element. I don't think there'll be any prizes for guessing where the tile occurs in this. That's clearly seamless here, clearly not seamless here, and not seamless running up this side either. So advertised online as a seamless texture, it is not, definitely not. You can see here these don't even match up, let alone are they the same color. Okay, that's just a highlight in the scene, so ignore that. Okay, so again, don't take it for granted that it's going to be seamless. That says it was when I downloaded it. It is very, very definitely not. So the resolution's one thing to think of. Checking to see if it actually is tileable is another thing. Okay, so let's move on to our next image then. Okay, so we've got another one here. We had that one there. So I mentioned this idea of repetition of pattern have been an issue. So we'll just look at this one. Okay, I'll just increase the size of it slightly. Now, if we were to put this into our scene, and it looks like it probably is tileable because we've lost half a plank there and the other half of the planks popped up in the bottom there, so it probably would tile. However, there are very, very clear elements here, like feature elements of the wood in there, which are going to be so obvious when we come to tiling our texture map. So obvious. Now, don't get me wrong, these bits are beautiful in the wood. They're great, they're really interesting. They add some more definition to the wood, make it a much more interesting piece of wood, but they're not going to be your friend when you come to doing some texture mapping. Okay, so let's continue on. Okay, so in our scene here, we'll do our thing again. We'll go in here, we'll load up our one there with a repetition issue. I've left that 2x2 UV repeats, and you can see it's almost tileable. There's a color difference there. It's certainly tileable in this direction. I don't see any great issue there. I think the seam is probably about here, somewhere there, but it's not an issue. The issue is there that there are very clear patterns in the wood and that the repetition there is very obvious. So that does indeed become an issue. So those are things you probably want to paint out, or when you take your photograph, take a slightly more, dare I say, a slightly less interesting piece of wood. Or, of course, you could consider how you could maybe, just crop out that single piece there. You certainly could paint out that piece there, but there are other ways around that. So repetition is not always going to be useful, or patterns are going to lead to problems in repetition. Okay, the last one there, you could go down the route and say, well, actually, what about just having a single plank? And I'll repeat that single plank. Well, again, this is an image I downloaded from the internet, just to show you the problem with doing those kind of things and not sourcing your own images. So we'll go in there, we'll have our repetition piece there. The problem there is that this image has not been cropped. It's actually got a white background on it, blank, then white background on it. So let's go into Photoshop, let's crop it down, and then we'll see what it looks like. Okay, so let's do that now. I'm in Photoshop now. I'm going to go and open that image up. Shouldn't take too long because I've got those in my textures folder. Again, you've got all these textures. These are not ordered properly, so we'll go into single plank repetition. It's automatically jumped into my crop tool, but we'll go into it there. I'm just going to zoom in a bit, so for you it'd be Control plus on your keyboard. I'm zooming in a bit so I can see where my crop occurs. I don't want to keep any of the white area in there, and then we'll do this and we'll crop it down to about there. Click the little tick. I'm just going to zoom out. In fact, I'll use the space bar and I'll just drag down. Yeah, see there's some white on top as well, so that's something we'll need to be mindful of. So we'll just zoom back out, we'll put our crop tool back in, we'll zoom in, space on keyboard to drag down, and then we'll crop the top off. If you find that it's snapping as you're doing this, which mine is, it's snapping and not letting me get to where I want, hold down the Control key. For me, it might be the Apple Command key, and it should avoid the snapping. It's actually still doing it on mine. Okay, anyway, it doesn't really matter for now, but there we go. Okay, so we'll zoom out. Make sure we can see the entire thing. So we've got a single plank. We'll file. We'll save that back out. I'll stick with JPEG, and I'll call it single plank. Version 2, and we'll save that, and we'll go back into Maya, we'll reload up our image. So by name, single plank version 2. We'll open that up. Now this has tiled that rather unfortunately. So what I'm going to do, just to get rid of all that, I'm going to have it to a single tile. Now clearly that's not going to work because it's stretched out my image there. So let's try going by 5. So we can see now we've got sort of 5 planks worth. I'm going to go a little bit further because it's actually a slightly thinner plank than that. Okay, so it's given me all my nice neat planks in there. It's very clearly tiled. You can see that not there in the wood. It's a pattern. It's an obvious tile. So again, sometimes having a single plank and then tiling it sounds like it's an attractive thing to do, or a single brick and then tiling it. But then you've got no variation whatsoever. You know, and if you ever have, you know, done any woodworking or brickworking or anything, you'll see that every single brick, every single plank of wood has got its own kind of features, its own kind of character almost, with, you know, different look, different tone, different knots in the wood and so on. Without that variety, suddenly you've just got too much repetition of the same thing. So it's a balance. You want to have some character, perhaps across certain elements, but not too much that it becomes pattern. So these are things to be mindful of. Okay, so that is the end of looking through our elements there. These are other bits we're going to work on a little bit later, so 6 and 7 there. Okay, so we'll leave it there for now. In the next video clip, we're going to have a look at how we could tidy up some texture maps to avoid repetition, to avoid seams. Okay, speak to you then.